Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung's full-scale diplomatic campaign ignited at the UN General Assembly is now entering a critical phase. While his End initiative drew attention on the global stage, unresolved tariff disputes with Washington are escalating. U.S. President Trump bluntly called Korea's $350 billion investment a prepayment, raising pressure and drawing clear lines. Now, with a Korea-Japan summit next and a possible Trump-Xi encounter at the APEC, Seoul's ambitions to serve as a bridge between rival powers face a tough diplomatic stress. To break down Korea's diplomatic strategy and key regional issues, we are joined in the studio by Christophe Gaudin, Professor of Political Science at Kookmin University. A big welcome, Professor.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
And also joining us online is Evan Servier, former U.S. Acting Assistant Secretary of State and non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Welcome.
Great to be with you again.
So let's start with Mr. Revere right away. So President Lee Jae-myung has returned home after wrapping his schedule at the UN General Assembly. And from his keynote speech to presiding over an open UN Security Council debate, I wonder, how did you assess President Lee's overall performance?
Well, this was obviously President Lee's first appearance at this very important, on this very important stage. I think President Lee was clearly determined to show leadership, to show initiative, to show ambition, and also to underscore the Republic of Korea's international activism. And I think on all of those fronts, he certainly succeeded. I think it's also fair to say that he showed a willingness to take some risks as he proposed the END, the End initiative towards North Korea, because he did so despite the fact that Pyongyang has consistently and strongly rejected all of his previous efforts, all of his government's previous efforts to restart dialogue, to promote exchange, and to pursue denuclearization. And President Lee was, I think, treading on somewhat dangerous turf as he explained the initiative, both at the UN General Assembly in his remarks, but also in some press interviews that he did, because he demonstrated a willingness to defer denuclearization and even accept a freeze of North Korea's nuclear program, a freeze that could not possibly be monitored because the North Koreans have consistently refused monitoring. And President Lee's remarks, both at the UNGA as well as in those interviews, drew quite a bit of criticism, including from some who thought that this program, this initiative, might put South Korea on the slippery slope to a de facto acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear country for a long time to come. On other fronts, I think President Lee's visit came in the midst of what is frankly a downturn in U.S. ROK ties. And as a result of the unfortunate ICE arrest of Korean workers in Georgia, the strong U.S. pressure on South Korea to invest in the United States, the large tariffs that the United States has imposed on South Korea, and the continued uncertainty about the U.S. defense commitment and the status of U.S. forces. All of those things are on the agenda right now, and all of them, all of these issues, with the exception of what happened in Georgia, have been bubbling under the surface since even before President Lee's recent summit with President Trump. But those issues have now come to the surface again. And if nothing else, I think President Lee's recent visit was a reminder that there is a lot of hard work to be done to keep U.S. ROK relations on a steady course.
Definitely a lot of details to be sorted out in the coming months to come. But before we get into the details, I also want to hear Professor Gaudin's opinion on the so-called End initiative that President Lee has laid out. How would you evaluate the substance and the feasibility of the proposal?
I think the best way I could summarize it will be a smaller, a downsized, a more pragmatic version of the sunshine policy of previous democratic presidents. In fact, the end game of President Lee is denuclearization. Anybody in their right mind will aim at the same objective. However, as Mr. Revere mentioned, the North is never to give up on their nuclear weapons realistically, because what is this nuclear capacity for Kim Jong-un's regime? It is their life insurance. It is the insurance that they will never get kicked out of power with foreign operations, the way Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi have been in the past. So if we want to discuss denuclearization with people who don't want to denuclearize, there is nothing to discuss. So hence this initiative. This initiative is a sort of step-by-step process, hence starting with basically exchanging, then eventually normalizing, and hopefully in a long run, maybe in the next generation, some hope for a denuclearized North Korea, eventually. The point I think to be most important to emphasize here is that it is a step-by-step process, and it is, in my opinion, pragmatic, reasonable, and frankly, what other path is there to take? It is a narrow path to take, but there is no other one anybody, I think, could think of, rationally speaking.
Right, so we will have to start with exchange, and it will really depend on how North Korea takes this message. Now, during this visit to the U.S., President Lee also held back-to-back meetings with the leaders of Poland, Italy, the Czech Republic, Uzbekistan, and they also emphasized, cooperation in defense and AI as well. So, taking aside from, step back from North Korea, how should we interpret these kinds of efforts by President Lee in the context of, the administration's pragmatic multilateral diplomacy?
I think in the same line, because it is the same inspiration that is found behind all of this policy. The situation of South Korea is dangerous and relatively easy to summarize. South Korea is a middle power, surrounded with aggressive neighbors, and for a while South Korea could count on the US as the backbone of their foreign policy. As we all know, right now, and for quite a few years, it won't be the case anymore. So the card President Lee has decided to play consists in playing multilateral policies. It consists in this time where populisms all over the world are pushing for more and more aggressive foreign policies. It is about branding Korea as a leader in multilateral foreign policies. So hence, as you mentioned, the fact that the debate that Myung hosted at the UN was about AI, hence these defense talks with countries that are a threat to nobody. What Myung is saying, I think, is that the world now needs more normalcy. And so it is about keeping all diplomatic channels open, or as open as possible. And so somehow the way I see it is that South Korea is planting for the future, because, again, realistically, there is no other path to be taken. South Korea is taken somewhere. South Korea is in the middle of this trade war to happen between the US and China, and South Korea is not powerful enough. I don't think South Korea has the will either to engage in this sort of escalation. And so in this context, the best card you have to play is multilateralism. And this is why I think it is killed, and so far it's been executed with, as Mr. Revere mentioned, with determination and with competence as well.
Right. So it really definitely shows Korea's will to broaden its diplomacy beyond its traditional sphere. Now, let's also touch upon economic issues, Mr. Revere. President Lee also met with Treasury Secretary Bessent in the bid to find a breakthrough in the ongoing tariff negotiations with Washington, of course. But Trump continues to stress that the $350 billion investment is a, quote, prepayment, underscoring the deep, rift between both sides. What do you think is behind Washington's, hardline stance?
Well, it's no secret that the core elements of Donald Trump's economic and trade policy include using tariffs as a revenue-generating tool, coercing allies and trading partners to invest in the United States, as the U.S. is trying to do right now with respect to this $350 billion. And in the course of doing all of that, trying to rebuild the U.S. Industrial base. President Trump's approach is largely driven by the belief that Korea and others have taken advantage of the United States for many decades, and that tariffs, investment demands, pressure to increase defense spending, and even demand payments in return for U.S. Defense support. All of these things are appropriate responses to that. So those are the core elements of Trump's approach and Donald Trump's thinking, and dealing with those rather unconventional views and very controversial views, I think, is going to be a major challenge, not just for Korea, but for other key American allies and trading partners going forward. We're in uncharted waters when it comes to dealing with all of these trade and economic issues here. And the attitude and the perspective that Donald Trump brings to this set of issues is particularly problematic.
Right, a very difficult situation that we're really in right now. So in light of this, Professor Gaudin, what kind of negotiation levers do you think South Korea has right now? What kind of strategic options are we left with?
There are few options because, as Mr. Riviere mentioned, and this is the backbone of President Trump's policy, Korea is selling to the US much more than they buy. And so, as a result, leverage is limited. What I can tell is that, first, Korea is producing semiconductors, just like Taiwan, and so far, for the moment, there have been no alternative for America but to import these semiconductors from East Asia. So that's one bargaining chip. But that's basically everything there is, because for the West, when it comes to cars, to shipbuilding and the like, there are alternate trading partners. So far, the approach that the Lee administration has been taking, it has been about trying to somehow negotiate with the US. For instance, a couple months ago with this Make American Shipbuilding Great Again, with so offering the US to invest in America in exchange for lowering these tariffs. There is no other option to be taken right now, because as Mr. Riviere mentioned, for the Trump administration, in the first place, these tariffs are a revenue-generating policy. Trump's tax cuts cost billions, even thousands of billions, and in the long run, and so in the result, they need to be compensated somehow. And there is no other reasonable way for America to compensate these tax cuts, but with these new revenues. So for Korea, long story short, thank God for semiconductors, and for the rest, wait and see, uncharted waters.
Right, so semiconductors could also play a key role in these negotiations. Now let's move on to a very important event that will be held tomorrow in South Korea's Busan City, the Seoul-Tokyo Summit. So, Professor, with Prime Minister Ishiba expected to step down early next month, what is the significance of this special summit tomorrow? Do you think it's a sign of renewed commitment, or?
It is exactly what it is, because nothing substantial is to be decided with no prime minister in Japan, and on top of it, nobody can tell for the moment what line the Liberal Democratic Party is to take in Japan, between the hardliners and the more centrists. No, I think the one goal of this summit can be summarized quite simply. It is about emphasizing that all channels of communication remain open between Korea and Japan, And between China and the US, the one solution Korea and Japan have is to stick together, regardless of who's the leader of such and such country. So that's what it is. It's just a sign that is being sent to the whole world. Nothing substantial can be decided in the absence of a Japanese leader, realistically.
So it's a symbolic message that we're open to, communication between both sides. So this, summit to be held tomorrow, it marks the first Korea-Japan summit since their meeting in Tokyo just around 38 days ago. What kind of agenda or key issues do you expect the two leaders to discuss, Mr. Revere?
Well, I think the bottom line for this this summit is that the task for Japan and South Korea is to try to keep up the momentum that they have achieved in their bilateral ties. They're doing things together now that they've never done before. There's a broad range of bilateral cooperation and trilateral cooperation that includes the United States, and that's a good thing. I think the goal here, at least for now, is to avoid any backsliding in terms of the level of cooperation and mutual support that they've achieved here. And I think another critical goal is to see what can be done to try to insulate the bilateral relationship from any possible political change that may happen in Tokyo in the coming days as the Japanese choose a new prime minister. And I think it's especially important in light of the possibility that there might be a rightward shift in Japanese politics. And I think both the Japanese prime minister and the Korean president understand that and are trying to figure out a way to insulate the relationship and insulate the accomplishments in the relationship from any of those shifts. I think they'll also, of course, try to explore new ways to expand and enhance cooperation. But the bottom line for this meeting is that it's a placeholder. It's meant to try to reassure each other. But more than anything, it's an attempt to keep up the momentum with a very wary eye on the immediate horizon about the possibility of political change in Japan.
Right, and it's clear that we're going to see some, political change, of course, in Japan's domestic politics. And speaking of that, then, Professor Gaudin, what kind of variables could, the change in Japan's inner politics bring to, Korea-Japan relations?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that the Liberal Democratic Party is not a party in the traditional sense of the term, because it is not exactly a force, a unified force, like the People's Party in Korea or the Republican Party in America. It's more like a conglomerate of tendencies that are extremely different, from centrist to much more hardline right-wing conservatives. And for the moment, what is happening in Japan is that, as you know, there is a populist right-wing party, the Sanseito, that's been extremely successful at the last elections. And honestly, I am not sure that the Japanese government themselves knows what to do. If you look at the bigger picture, over the last 3 decades, only 2 Japanese prime ministers, only 2, Koizumi and Abe, have lasted more than a couple of years. So this political crisis in Japan, it shows, in my opinion, a much larger state of disarray. Japan, for the moment, hasn't been able to find back the sort of magical mixture that made it so successful in the 80s and in the 90s. So everything is very secretive and mysterious about Japanese politics, I must say. What I can tell is that if the hardline LPD gets the prime ministry, probably they will move closer to America. And if a more centrist, more pro-business approach is to be taken, you can assume a more understanding approach to the claims of China and Korea. But for the moment, nothing I've been able to read in the press has been very indicative of one tendency taking the upper hand over the other. These are uncharted waters, again, for Japanese politics as well.
Right, so we'll really have to keep close eyes on the developments over in Tokyo. Now, before we conclude our discussion, Mr. Revere, let's talk about the U.S.-China dynamic at the APEC. There are growing interest in a possible first face-to-face between U.S. President Donald Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And President Lee, in a recent Time magazine interview, emphasized Seoul's role as a bridge between the two countries. What kind of diplomatic strategy do you think South Korea need in order to play a more meaningful mediating role there?
Well, obviously, President Trump and President Xi have met before. They've been on the phone. This would be, of course, the first summit between the two of this current Trump administration. There's been very intense interaction and communication between the United States and China behind the scenes in the run-up to the APEC summit. They've been talking about trade issues. They've been talking about things like TikTok and other matters. But as for the Republic of Korea and its role here, I always told my South Korean friends that I strongly advise them to avoid describing the Republic of Korea as a bridge between the United States ally, ROK, and the PRC, to avoid trying to play some sort of bridging role here. That really grates on the ears of a lot of policymakers in Washington. It doesn't sit well in Washington. It reminds policymakers of previous ROK rhetoric, where South Korea described itself as a balancer between the United States and China. And so in terms of the Korean strategy, the South Korean strategy, I think the number one thing on my list of recommendations would be careful of words like that, because they create a very uncomfortable sense in Washington about South Korea, and they have a tendency to perhaps even undercut confidence of the United States and U.S. policymakers in the ROK.
Right, a very important note to conclude our discussion tonight. I'm afraid that'll be all for today, but thank you so much for your insights, Professor Gaudin.
Thanks.
And of course, Mr. Revere, we really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Great to be with you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.